Welcome to our podcast, Revival in Jesus' Way. Disciple making is Jesus' way to change the world. This is the one mission that His people should focus on.
There is only one way, His way, to create lasting transformation, and God is calling His church to wake up.
I'm your host, Tim Cahill.
And I am Yin Xu. Now we are at the series called Foundation Series. Foundation Series is a list of topics which needs to be settled in a new Christian's life before they can continue to deeper Christian growth. We hope this series to be helpful to you in two ways. First, for your own growth. Test yourself if you have clarity and wrestle with any doubts on those areas. Second, for helping others, do you know how to bring clarity to the people you are discipling or to answer to a non-believer's question on those areas? For example, miracle, that's our today's topic. They won't just naturally get it as you become friends, unless someone intentionally wrestle with the truth and answer their questions. Today we're going to talk about miracles, mainly those supernatural God's actions. Since God exists, then God acts.
That's right. Yeah, so today we're talking about miracles, and we're talking about really God's action in the world. And is it reasonable that God acts in the world? And we're aiming towards three different people. One is people who vaguely believe in kind of spirituality, but in general specifically disagree with biblical miracles. Another is people who once believed. Either they once believed in the faith, in the Christian faith, or they once believed strongly that miracles do happen, and they did happen, but they've moved away from that because they haven't seen answers to certain prayers.
And also we want to help people who believe miracles are not scientific or rational to believe.
Yeah, that's right. So we're trying to, in general, talk about the reasonableness of seeing that God acts in the world. So and to begin, I want to give my own story because I think it'll give a good background of where I'm coming from in talking about this topic and how my experience has really played into shaping and my exploring this topic. This has really been a topic, I think, along with the problem of evil, this has been one of the big topics that I've thought about and wrestled through with God over a long time. So I grew up in more a charismatic church, a non-denominational church where people really believed and saw miracles. The small group that kind of became this church came from a lot of those big kind of revivalist moments that happened, that where some big kind of miraculous things happened. Like the leader of the church was a former biker gang leader whose wife was a stripper, and they were transformed by Christ into really where they couldn't be in that environment anymore. It was a huge transformation. Their lives completely took a 180-degree change.
So their life testimony is it was a miracle, a big miracle.
Yeah. And it wasn't just them, but it was a lot of people in this area. I have aunts who experienced these miraculous changes and letting go of drug use, and also an experience of seeing healings, of seeing really God act and answering prayers. There was so much of that in their story and in the story of this church that it really became part of the DNA. So I remember growing up as a kid and being inundated into that environment where there was a lot of answered prayer. There was things that very specifically looked and in every way seemed like it was a miracle. You could really tell that there were miraculous things happening. However, as I was growing up, I often felt I didn't see my own prayers answered. And this began to kind of stifle my early kind of childhood, just general belief in God and in His power in the world. And what further added to that was, especially later in my life as a young person, I was baptized actually at the age of 12, although my foundation in the Christian faith was not very deep, and it was kind of a family thing to do once you got to a certain age. In the Sunday school class I went to, they basically, once you graduated from Sunday school, you were supposed to be baptized because it was expected. Oh, now you know enough. You've made a confession. You were supposed to really go home and think about it, make a confession of your faith, and now you're going to go and be baptized. But I would say that I didn't really have much of real faith to really know what salvation meant at that time. But later on, something that really shook my faith and was in this topic of miracles. My uncle died of cancer when I was a younger teenager, and we all really experienced the whole process of him, kind of his life kind of fading, and it was very hard, especially on my cousins, on my aunt. And this experience and just seeing so many people pray for him and pray for his health. Yeah, the whole family praying. And also one of my cousins was given what he really felt like was a prophecy from God to say that he would save his dad. But then in the end, we saw his life kind of physically fade more and more. And we didn't see him healed, even though it seemed like there were these confirmations or these things. So this was a major point that really got me thinking about miracles. I had something like I had seen these miraculous things happen when I was younger. I had seen real answers to prayer, with really like being in hard, difficult situations and God coming through supernaturally. Like again and again, we would sometimes receive exactly enough money because we grew up pretty poor, so we would need money for bills or something like that. They would be ready to turn off electricity. We wouldn't tell anybody. We would pray about it, and really someone would just all of a sudden provide exactly that much money without anybody knowing. There was no one going out and secretly saying these things to other people. No one knew, but sometimes we'd get boxes of food just suddenly. The church people would say, yeah, just drop to your home. Sometimes even randomly, people didn't even know us. And so I had this confidence that God acts, but then this really challenged my belief why didn't God physically heal him?
Because if God can act that miracle, then God can act on this miracle. So why God acting this way and not acting that way?
Exactly.
So that's also my confusion too. Like in the previous episode that I said, actually we started this podcast is 1 month after my dad suddenly passed away in a very young age in China during the pandemic time when the pandemic just broke out in China 1 or 2 months after that. So we were completely shocked because we planned a future with them. We want to live together with them and to really enjoy the intergenerational family live together, the joy. And also my dad just began to more and more embrace this space, and he began to share the gospel. He began to memorize verses. And my mom has such a hope to co-work with him in the Great Commission, and also the hometown house church that they have been a part of the leadership that just set out to begin. And I was thinking when I first heard about it, he was in a hospital, and when my relative told me the things went really bad, even at that time, I think it was such a spiritual attack. God saved him from that, and he will not die. He will not die. And it can be. It's so hard. First, my mom fell and went to the hospital, and 3 days after that, my dad passed away because he was the caregiver, and he tried to improve his kidney problem, but just to improve, but then he died of heart attack that he the 1 or 2 years before his passing, he went to hospital so frequently, tried to fix his kidney problem, and then no doctor even point out he has that problem. And then like, God, why didn't you remind us? We pray so much for his healing, for his health in the last 1 or 2 years. Why none of the prayers listened? So my whole world was darkened. And then it's like our whole family, we try to bind up together, has one heart for your mission. And isn't that better that if my parents and Tim and I, we all strive for your kingdom for a while, and you gave him a long happy life. You can heal him, heal his kidney problem, right? Even those hidden health issues. So it's the why, and then for that first month, I could not go to church. I could not pray because I don't know what to pray. And isn't that God lead us to learn about the charismatic side, the spirit-filled side of this faith, and learn about healing prayer. And even that we joined the OSL group. It's called the Order of Saint Luke. It's the organization. It's a very biblical organization for teaching people about healing prayer and healing ministry. So we're thinking, and many people pray for them, and even until now, my mother hasn't recovered yet, and she's herself. God sent many help along the way, but at least God heal her more quickly, so to cover our pain of losing a loved one. Like so much of those questions actually linger in my mind that I can't even write a book. All those. I think it's all those questions a normal person would ask. On and off, and
that's right. Yeah. And again, it's very hard, and it's very difficult going through those things and really wrestling with it, especially because, like Anne said, what God really led us to right before that actually was through this Biola apologetics classes, had been studying like the topic of miracles, and then we also at OSL we were studying, we were really praying for people and things like that, and we were hearing stories of people who have been healed and things like that. We've even seen it in our own life.
Miracles.
Right. And I wrote a few papers and those things, and did research, reading through Craig Keener's book on miracles and different arguments for God's action in the world and things like that. But then right after that, we had all this tragedy that comes all of a sudden, and it seems like God is not answering. So that's kind of just to understand some of it's actually very difficult for us in even making this episode. This was one thing actually a struggle. I wanted to make it last week, but then we end up making it this week, just because it's really hard. Even though we understand some of these things, we've worked through some of these things, still there's a lot of pain associated with it. So we're not kind of just abstractly talking about these things, but really it's from our own deeply wrestling and struggling through to really see what is the answer. Is it really reasonable to believe that God acts in the world? Yeah, so there's two different ways that we can come out of this, and there's two wrong answers, and then there is the truth, which is in between those two things. One part is you say, from these events having happened, well, I guess God just doesn't act in the world, and just being convinced that this proves that God doesn't act.
Tragedy can drive people to quickly conclude that, well, I guess God just doesn't act. Even those accounts in the Bible, they just don't count. Why? I don't want to think about it because I'm too painful.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's too painful to think about it, and it's just, if he didn't act in this case, then I just want to give it up. So that's one way, and then another one is just kind of ignoring all these things and saying, well, this and this and this is true about God the way that I see it, and I just in a way, like just going to ignore those things and just say, well, anytime I pray, it's just going to happen no matter what. So if you block out the evidence, if you block out these things that really happen, that's another way to kind of get off the scale, I think, to be in the to have the wrong thinking about it. We need a view that's in between those two, that doesn't just reject God's actions because of the pain, but then at the same time it doesn't try to just say, well, I'm just going to ignore all of that and I'm just going to say that this and this and this, and God should ignore the pain, ignore the reality, ignore the reality of these times that are very hard, that really prayer is not answered, and just kind of giving like a very shallow or inauthentic statement that, oh well, God works in mysterious ways, and then but I still believe the exact same thing about God's action in the world.
That, because in our family, nobody dare to say God acts in a mysterious way. It's such a cliche.
Sure, it is a cliche. One way that I think starting out to think about this issue in a logical way from the beginning is think about, in a situation, we imagine a world where a miracle really did happen, and we want to think about what does it mean for those people believing in it. Why are they justified in it? And then are we in turn justified in it? So imagine with me and the Exodus story. Most people know it, when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt into the promised land. And imagine for me that really happened, whether you're a believer or not. And so that Moses really led the people of Israel out of Egypt, that there were these different miracles, these different plagues that happened, these 10 plagues. They were very obvious, they were very big. You see Moses going in and talking to Pharaoh, and you see these miracles. Now I want you to imagine, once they've traveled for 40 years and they've begun to enter the promised land, and that old generation has died off, this second generation, which didn't directly see those 10 plagues and things like that, what would they think about the 10 plagues? Do you think that they would believe they happened, or do you think that they would think that, oh well, that's impossible, miracles shouldn't happen in the world? I think that in their case they would believe. I think it would just be very obvious that they would believe, and part of it, there's some different reasons for that, right? All the stories that people tell, all the life stories and the things about their life and things like that, the things they remember, their memories, this would be a huge part of it. That every person that they hear, that they talk to, would tell them about, oh, I remember the time when the fire was literally falling from the sky after Pharaoh had again denied to let us go out of Egypt. I remember when the land was covered with frogs, and it was just all of a sudden, it had never been frogs like that, and there were frogs everywhere. And you hear these stories again and again, not just from one person, but reconfirmed from another person and another person and another person, so that it's there's these believable witnesses. They aren't people who have any reason to lie about it, right? That's one thing. Like
But can people say that Asian people are just silly?
Well, at that time they wouldn't, right? Because that's just one generation before them, and it's everybody. So in that case, if you're thinking about being that generation, you don't have any. It's your parents. It's people who are close to you. It's people you know. It's not like some foreign weird person. It's people you know, and you know
what
their
I mean
reasons.
is, nowadays people would say people thousands of years ago, they could not think clearly, and also because there was no science, people are just not smart.
Right. So, and I think so, and that kind of leads to another angle of how they're figuring this out, and the way they're figuring this out is not really by using science. It's actually by using some of just basic logic, right? In this case, those things that kind of come out of science and things like that, it doesn't really apply, because it has to do with this is just basically reporting for them. It's just reporting something they saw, right? It's something they experienced. They really experienced this, and this crazy thing out of their normal experience happened. Like, we're not talking about something that was like from the results of some experiment or something like that, right? We're talking about something that is just based on what they had seen themselves. Yeah. So, but you can imagine in this story that those people in that next generation, that they would have confidence because they wouldn't have any counter witnesses. They would have these people in their generation telling them these stories about what had happened. There would be kind of the fact that they went from Egypt. They'd see like they had these Egyptian jewels and things like that, but then how did they come from Egypt actually to be in this land? Like, that needs an explanation.
That's an evidence.
Yeah.
And also, everybody say that. Everybody gave the similar account.
Mm-hmm.
So if this is not true, then it needs to be a conspiracy, collective conspiracy of everybody lied, and everybody should lie in the same way.
Yeah, exactly.
And what was their motivation?
Yeah, what are they making up a story about? So all I'm doing by this is showing that it's possible in a situation, there can be miracles, and someone who didn't see those miracles can actually really have good reason to believe that those miracles happened. Mm-hmm. And so this gets into there are these different tests. How do we know today? How can we say if a miracle has happened, whether back in history, so like a long time ago, like in the biblical days, or nowadays? Like, how can we know? So there are these 3 tests that we should run in order to see if a miracle has really happened. One is thinking through the types of logic. What kind of reasoning are we using in order to figure out whether or not a miracle has happened? 2 is to think about some of these main objections people bring up. So we'll talk through those, but are these objections really valid? 3 is thinking about, why does God act as he does, right? We need to have a grasp on why God acts as he does in order to really be able to grasp and really be able to wrap our minds around it and really be able to have the heart to explore, is this a miracle or not? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so for the first part about logic, right? So there's different kinds of in logical theory, or in what the basic forms of logic that are used. There's 3 forms of that. There's deductive, inductive, or abductive. Deductive logic is taking different true statements and inferring something as they go along. So you take a true statement, like we talked about for God's existence. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. You take any true statement for a deductive argument, and then you add another statement. So the example we gave in the previous podcast was the universe had a beginning. So from the first statement, we can see that the second statement is true, and then we're going to go into a conclusion that the universe does have a cause. We're not using deductive logic for the Exodus story. So deductive logic is a way of thinking, and it's a way of saying, like, well, this happened. So what we're using in this Exodus story is more of abductive logic. So these are just different ways of reasoning and figuring out if something has happened. So inductive logic is like saying, like, oh, well, a certain percentage of people do this, so this is probably true. So it's talking about something is probably true for inductive logic. And use some inductive logic here, right, in some way, maybe saying like, oh, well, this many people all say that this happened, so probably this happened. But then the main thing we're using is called abductive logic. So that's logic, basically reasoning from the best explanation, from possible options. Mm-hmm. So you're thinking through, like, what are the possible options in a miracle situation? One option is, did that person lie? Right? Mm-hmm. If that person could lie, or is that person crazy?
That group of person.
Yeah, or that person or did that group of people lie? Are they crazy?
Yes. Had a delusion.
Yeah, are they delusional? That's right. Did they see something that happened and they thought it was one thing, or was it actually something else? Mm-hmm. Right, that's another option. So like you're thinking through these different options and your reasoning, is this is what they're saying that happened, the most likely conclusion from those things. And so we see, like in the Exodus story, in this very clear example where we're imagining a story where there is a miracle in this possible world, they're using this kind of logic with that group of people. Well, yes, because everyone agrees, because there's no reason for them to lie because of this. It means that, one, everyone wouldn't be crazy, right? Because you've seen that they're not crazy. You've interacted with them in other ways. So you know the people group that is talking is sane. You know that they're not lying because there's no reason for them to lie. And their answers seem to conjoin with like the reality of what's happened. You know that they're not maybe imagining it because these things are so kind of big and they're so obvious and they're so accepted across from different perspectives. People see that this has happened, that you know it's not just something someone like missed or someone was like, oh, well, I thought it was this, but it wasn't this. So that's what, and it's a very, so it's, you can see it's a very solid way of reasoning because it has to be one of these options. So one example, just real quick to finish up this area, is that thinking about who would use this kind of logic, and you think about detectives, or in a lot of jobs this is used. So like in a detective case, like you'll say like, or in a court case, or a lot of things, you'll say like, well, what happened here? You know, if you're investigating employees and you think someone is stealing, you realize the money has been taken. You say, well, what is the explanation for this? Is it true that maybe the money just got lost? Well, is there some place for it to get lost? Who all has access? If only one person has access, then it probably didn't just get lost. You know, it can't just magically come out of the cashier. But this is a very valid way of reasoning, right? It may not be scientific to the point to where you're not running experiments and everything, but you can really tell, hey, what happened to this money? So you're figuring it out. What is the best explanation? And then you can reason out to actually determine whether or not that person should be fired. Because if only one person had access, only one person had the key, that money is missing, that person has a new hat that they couldn't afford before, it's very obvious, hey, this person probably stole this money. We should fire that person. You know, that we will make a choice based on an abductive way of reasoning. And we feel confident that that was a good choice. We didn't make a big mistake, unless some new evidence comes out.
So it's based on the evidence and facts we can already know, and then to come up with different options and see which one is most real. So like the Exodus story, such a big group of people left Egypt. It's not like just in the Old Testament there are such kind of recordings. In those Egyptian history should be some, I don't know the name, but they should have some, right? And other history book. It's just in other history book, maybe it's not so clear about the 10 plagues.
There are some good reasons for believing that that has happened. The second test is, I think there are two main objections that people will bring out against miracles. One is that science has kind of explained away
We already discussed
all miracles, and we have, we've been discussing this over time, but again, science is a specific kind of thing, right? I think, and the other day when we were talking about it, you said that science talks about these regular patterns. It discovers information about these regular patterns of things. But actually, to try to expect something that's discovering things about regular patterns to be able to know about miracles, which are not a regular pattern, right? It's God's action according to his personality, according to how he desires to act. It's not something regular that you can just study in that way. It's different. That's one reason why a lot of times people talk about psychology and they kind of put it on the outskirts of science, and a lot of times don't call it a hard science in that way, because even with just people, right, who you can observe regularly, it's very hard to predict, and it's very hard to make a lot of determinations out of people's actions, what people are and what they really mean by things. And that's why, so science isn't really a good tool for figuring out miracles, right?
And science can be used in some way. For example, if they dig out a tomb or something from that time, and then they use some kind of a ways to study about those bones or things, that part. Just like in a murder case, science should be used when they study the dead body. Can test the blood, see the fingerprint, those things. But it's not used as scientific way to solve the case. When you solve the case, you need to use the logical way.
Yeah, exactly. To figure out those things. And that's another thing that science does and doesn't do. Science does give you specific facts. So you can discover some facts. You can't discover all facts with science, but you can really discover and confirm some very specific things with science. And that's a tool that science is very good at. It's very good at getting to the truth in some areas. And you can use that truth that is discovered through science as a piece of evidence. But it is not the process of taking in the evidence and then figuring it out. That's logic. And we have to use a kind of logical method of figuring out what the evidence means, putting meaning to the evidence. The other objections are mainly ad hominem objections, or they're objections that try to aim at the people who talk about miracles instead of actually thinking about miracles. So they'll say, like you said earlier, and that we hear this from people who say, well, people back in that time are just very ignorant. But then again, this is separate from the actual claim, can miracles happen? Because whether or not miracles can happen does not have to do with whether or not there are ignorant people making those claims or whatever it is, actually. Because it's just if a miracle can be thought about and discovered, has to do with taking in the evidence and figuring out what happened with it. So that's what even today we have to do. We have to take in the evidence. What are the facts we can know about this situation and figure it out? Now, I disagree with the idea that people a long time ago were very ignorant, because actually you read a lot of the writings from people a long time ago, and a lot of time their logic is much clearer than nowadays in this kind of YouTube, TikTok kind of generation. I mean, we have science, and so that can help get certain facts, but really people's logic nowadays is very...
Well, because our modern people, our brain has lots of distractions.
Yeah,
think about at that time, people didn't have the electricity, light bulb, those things. Really, when they look at the sky and stars, they think a lot, about God and eternity, those things. Instead of, we sometimes just bow our head and look at little screen and one by one short something to just feed onto us, instead of we ourselves have some quiet time and have some deep thinking. But then that must make us feel much better. We think, wow, people before us are all not so smart, and then each generation gets smarter.
Which is
where did that come
funny
from?
That they said that actually this is something I remember reading in one history book. They're talking about this has actually been something people have been saying forever, basically. That there were people making these complaints in these ancient works about the people more ancient than them. Because people, it's always this kind of fallacy that the people before you are dumber, and then you are smarter, but really that's not the way the world works, and that's not what we see.
And the main thing is, people before you, they died. They cannot defend for themselves. So you can say whatever you like.
Yeah, exactly. And they're not going to specifically argue with you, especially if you have culture like nowadays and you're not even going to read the things they wrote. You're just going to kind of use what I think are this kind of ha-ha kind of answer, and then say, because of this ha-ha answer, I'm going to just ignore everything you said. And that's why it's kind of this ad hominem. It's like
also think about modern people. They when they read those deep books, actually 100 years ago, 200 years ago, even those classics, people find it's more of course it's more difficult to digest than those TikTok short videos.
Yeah, exactly. So these are kind of ad hominem, just talking about the people at that time, or saying that, like, another objection that's ad hominem is people say, well, you Christians just believe in miracles to comfort yourself. You feel comforted, and they'll begin to explain out all these reasons why it's comforting to believe that miracles exist. And all that may be true. It is in some ways more comfortable to believe that there's a God who's acting on your behalf. Now, I would also say that it's more uncomfortable to believe that there really is sin and that we really are guilty in front of an eternal God. I would say that also comes with it, and that's not necessarily so comfortable. But the objection itself about whether the believing in miracles is comfortable also doesn't touch on the evidence. You still have to look at the evidence to determine, is there enough evidence there to determine that a miracle has or hasn't happened. So you can't just kind of dismiss, say, Christian, I don't really even look into that stuff because Christians just do that to comfort themselves. Actually, that's not a good answer. So you need to go deeper to really have a good answer, or just accept that you're kind of accepting this mushy way around the problem. But if we really want to look into the problem, we need to examine the evidence of that specific miracle and say, is this the best explanation based on what has happened? Is this person telling the truth? Is this person crazy? What's happening here? And then finally, the last part, and this is, I think, a really difficult part, and this is really the area where we've struggled, because I think these other two areas we've accepted, and over the years it's just those are pretty obvious.
The third test is about why God acts in this way.
Yeah, why does God act in that way? And why does God do miracles at one point and not do miracles at another point?
Mm-hmm.
One atheist objection that's pretty common is, why doesn't God just display I exist on the sky over New York City
mm-hmm.
and Beijing and all those major cities all at once so everybody would know that he exists?
Mm-hmm. Why?
So, and I think this is a good one to kind of get into why God does what he does, because that is not what God is. So what God is trying to do, what we see through Scripture of what God is trying to do with people is he's trying to, in Genesis 1, he gives people this authority over the world. He gives Adam authority to name all the animals. He gives Adam and Eve dominion over all things on the earth. So he's trying to create people to be these rulers of the earth, good, benevolent rulers who are just and virtuous and good. And so he wants also a family, people who really love and authentically care for one another. And first and foremost, he says, like if you look at the 10 Commandments and those things, the first thing, like Jesus said, the two greatest commandments, the first commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your strength, your soul. So it's just really loving authentically from your heart. Now, if you can imagine seeing that I exist on the sky and God making it very, very, very clear that he
mm-hmm.
exists, actually people would be scared into obeying his law,
mm-hmm.
because they would say, oh, this God really does exist. It's like if it in such an obvious, forceful way, then it's in a way, it's kind of like you think about the Nazi regime when they go to those streets and begin to enforce their laws on people.
Mm-hmm.
People would obey, but not authentically. They wouldn't love those soldiers.
Or just like relationship. Very few, a normal person would fall in love with stalker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Stalkers who say, I love you,
yeah.
I love you. Wow.
Hey, yeah, like I really love you, and you must, and I am powerful enough, for you to make you my wife. Like that wouldn't endear love. That might really make you part of that person's family, but it would be a weird, difficult family that you would really want to get away from. But mm-hmm. God doesn't want that. God wants us to want him.
Mm-hmm.
God he's desirable, and who he is, and being and worshiping God is what we're created to do. But we need to get there. But we're not there. We're sinful and in this corrupt way that's come from this sin nature that's come from Adam, and we want our own way. And his goal is to transform humanity. First, it's to justify us through Jesus Christ. Jesus said, I came to seek and to save the lost. So that's God's purpose in the world. It's taking us, lost humanity, and trying to bring us to be this glorious sons of God, sons and daughters of God, to bring us into that. And that doesn't happen through easy, straightforward ways we imagine a lot of times. And I think the second point is that God acts in such a way to see this happen. So sometimes people will say, well, why doesn't God? And this is where it begins to touch into, I think, a lot of healing ministries and things like that. People will just say, well, if you just name it, claim it. If you just pray and you have enough faith, then God will do it.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, this is also off, because it's not just about you pray and have faith. It's about really trusting in God and what He's doing. It's being one heart with God. And so because the way God will act, God uses His resources in the way to really pursue the thing that He's doing in the world. So what God is doing in the world is to seek and save those who are lost. And what we see, like, for instance, in Jesus' ministry, you see Jesus going from place to place, and He heals many people, but He doesn't just open a hospital. Right? He doesn't just say, well, I'm just going to work here for the rest of my life, and I'm going to use these healing powers to heal people and to solve world hunger and this, and then those, or He could say, oh, for you disciples, I'm going to have a regular healing time and just heal all of your relatives and heal the people around you. But He didn't do that. He kept moving from town to town. He kept moving and making Himself unavailable in some ways, because the thing He was trying to do, the thing God is trying to do, is to seek and save the lost, to help people to hear the gospel message, to be transformed and to continually be transformed, and to transform others. That's what we talk about in the Great Commission, is to go therefore and make disciples, make others who have that authentic heart. So this is what God's action is aimed towards. And I think in the evidence, when you look into, like, someone like Francis McNutt, for instance, we talk about OSL. Francis McNutt's ministry was very much centered on going out and preaching the gospel, and then in those kind of those meetings where there were many healings and things like that, it was all part of that. It was part of evidencing towards that very specifically. And so we see God blessing those sorts of things. We see God blessing, you talk about David Wilkerson's ministry, a lot of miracles, really miraculous, like The Sword and the Switchblade is a great book to read and to see the sort of things God did through him. But it was always in the context of David Wilkerson going out and doing the ministry. It wasn't kind of to comfort him in his family life. It wasn't to put on a big sign for the people in the New York neighborhood to see, oh, God is here. It was really to add power to a ministry that was preaching the gospel, that was transforming people into disciples of Jesus, that was fulfilling God's purpose in the world. And so that is really what we see, the pattern of how God acts. So this is that third, I think, piece or key that goes into it, right? That why does God act the way He acts? He acts according to His purpose.
Story. He needs to lead His people out first and set up a godly country, even though they fail, but that's God's intention. And then to evangelize to the whole world through this nation. And that's what he promised to Abraham, that all the nations on the earth will be blessed through his descendants.
Exactly. Yeah, and so you can see really when you get this filter on, and really this filter is not something that's easy to put on, because again, it's taken tragedy after tragedy and seeing these things for us to really, I think, wrestle through these things and understand more and more this is what God's action in the world is like. One verse that you mentioned the other day, Anne, was 1 Peter 4:1 and 2. It says, "Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves in the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God." So like there's good effects also that suffering and those things have on us. And like the whole goal of God in this transformation, in showing people in such a way that they will be changed, is to produce that. So sometimes suffering is called for, sometimes a miracle is called for, sometimes His ministry is called for. So yeah, so this is the overall explanation. The three keys again are: one, thinking about what way do we think about miracles. We think in a logical way. We need to put the evidence together. We need to think of what is the evidence, And then in an abductive kind of way, we think through what is the best explanation for this evidence. And if there was a miracle, then we ought to have a miracle on the plate to determine whether it happened or not. The next one is thinking through the objection. Science is not a good objection. These ad hominem or these kind of attacks on the kind of people who believe in miracles are not good objections. You still need to look at the evidence. And then finally, why does God act the way he does? He acts according to his purposes, according to his mission, according to his character, and according to what his plan is for the world and for people.
It's also about the people's condition. So
right.
Jesus mentioned about when a nation or a city is more bound of sin, that actually God's miracle is more difficult to happen. But sometimes we think, oh, this city is so full of, like Matthew 16:4 says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. We know many things are wrong that we know, but then every time when people commit sin and do it, adultery is like you reject God. I reject God's ruling. I reject God's action here. So God gave you the freedom by not showing the sign, not showing a miracle. So when we talk about how God acts, it's also about humans' condition, humans' choice. Right. But then sometimes we say the contrary, that we don't see the part, the reason for God's not acting is because of people's lack of faith, because people's openly reject God. So the more the society reject God, the less you will see miracles.
Exactly. Yeah, it has a lot to do with the condition of those it's being proclaimed to, and whether or not it will. I think it's always whether or not it will really have the effect of drawing people really in an authentic, real way to God. Because whenever people don't really have this faith in God, I think it becomes more and more like that kind of forcing people into this, and God is not going to do that. And God is not going to force you into a relationship with himself. He is going. If you continue on and say, I don't want anything to do with God, actually I don't even think he acts, I don't, and really that's what it is. It's saying, I don't want anything to do with you, God. As a society, we don't want anything to do with you, God. Then God is not going to act directly in that society. He will act less and less. Even Jesus couldn't do miracles in his hometown because it says the people didn't have faith. They didn't want to see that from him. Yeah.
They wanted to kill him. Yeah. So in the end, I asked myself the question, actually, during this grief time, I asked myself, what is the biggest tragedy to me and to human being? What is the biggest tragedy? The biggest tragedy is to separate from God. Just like the very beginning of the human history, that people separate from God. So, or from the a secular view, I can say to die is the biggest tragedy. But guess what? What will happen if I die? Even if I'm sick, I'm sick now, and then if I die, what could happen? I would see God, and I will see my dad and my grandpa, and then I will wait for my other loved one to come to me, right? I would be on the waiting list to wait for my reward for my earthly ministry. Right? So it's all those things. It's like before I had a major loss in my life, it's just kind of like, even though I'm a Christian, but then I kind of halfly thinking this way. I'm not completely put my hope to the new heaven and earth, put my hope to the restoring of God's kingdom. I I didn't really get excited when I quote the Lord's Prayer that God's kingdom come, and then we're part of it. We make disciples. We cultivate God's kingdom with God in someone's life to embrace the future. God's kingdom fully come to His heaven and His earth, and that's a wonderful thing. All those struggles and tears and sadness, grief, all of those things will be history. After a while in the paradise and then later in heaven, you wouldn't even remember that. Just like, well, I was in grief for 5 months, but then in this 5 months, what is my dad doing? I'm thinking that he start a new life and then he wouldn't even miss the life on earth. It's hard for us to imagine, right? It's hard for us to imagine. And then for your uncle's case, that the cancer was very, very painful, but the cancer kind of shook him to realize the reality of heaven and earth, to finally shook him to be serious about the biblical truth, so that he wouldn't fall into the biggest tragedy. The biggest tragedy is people are not serious about God and then go to hell.
That's right.
That's the worst thing. And then it's the same desire God has for his family and his friends who are still alive. And so you can see God plan out long term for the with the best intention. And then people say, even those things happen. How can you say that? It's because we are to understand what kind of a person God is first, instead of have our own imagination on who God should be, how God should act, and then it doesn't. If it doesn't match with your imagination, then you just lose your temper, right? And then you cannot think clearly. Oftentimes, actually, it's this pattern.
That's right. Yeah, you quoted the verse earlier when God says through Isaiah, "Who is able to advise the Spirit of the Lord, and who knows enough to give him advice or teach him?" But oftentimes that's the way we take to miracles. We say, we have this picture of you, God, and you need to meet into this picture. And often we say, oh, it's a very good picture. God really should be this way. But then we don't ask God.
I was there before. Yeah. But can you really be God's advisor? Do you know how to create even not the whole world, but the smallest thing? Do you know how to do that?
Yeah, and that's Job. That's God's comments to Job, right? He says, he made, these hills. He made the mountains. He made, the sea creatures. He made all of these things.
And where were you?
Himself. Yeah, where were you when he was doing this? And the thing is that Job knows from this is, well, that's unfathomable even. And I couldn't have helped with that. Like that, the creation, you think about God's mind and all that he did and all that he put into it and all that he's thinking and considering in the world and his purposes, and say that, well, yeah, God, you are above us. You are thinking and considering things that we are not considering, that we don't even have the whole picture of, that we don't grasp fully. And so we need to learn from God and not ask God to learn from us. We think about the eternal God who has wisdom that's been developed from eternity past, and then we have lived for these 30 years, or some even like older, even like if you're 80 or 90 years, that's nothing, not even a blip, not even 1% on the experience and the knowledge of God.
So this is today's our topic. Do you still believe in miracles? Maybe you believe when you were 5 years old, and then after many things happen, it kind of shovel in the dark or gray area, corner, and it becomes your actually permanent hidden bitterness, or even obstacle from fully devote to God. And we invite you to think about it, and we also invite you to encourage the people around you to engage in this topic, because there shouldn't be anything in between of an intimate relationship. If we have something harbor there in our heart, then we cannot really be completely open to God and have a great relationship. And God desires that.
Yeah.
And please leave us any comment and subscribe to our channel.
Yeah. Thank you.